Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. I see folks trickling in. We're going to give it about 1.5 to 2 more minutes for people to sign in, and then we'll get started. Thank you. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Want to welcome everyone on to our Zoom call today with the Honorable Elliott Abrams. It's a pleasure to have him. I just want to start by introducing myself and welcoming you. My name is Maria Friedman, and I'm the new Executive Director of Rhode Island Coalition for Israel, or we like to call ourselves RICI for short. We are a grassroots nonprofit coalition made of Christians and Jews working together to combat anti-Semitism, or as we like to call it, Jew hatred, educate about Israel, promote Judeo-Christian values, and strengthen the alliance between the U.S. and Israel. I invite you to check out our website. Actually, if you look at it tomorrow night, it'll be a completely new site, so we're excited to launch that, and I'll also drop our donation link if you'd like to support our efforts. Everything counts as a grassroots nonprofit if you would like to donate. And also, it is a pleasure to introduce our host and moderator of this talk, Andrew Pessin. He is a professor of philosophy at Connecticut College and campus bureau editor for the Algeminer. He's the author of many recent articles and books, as well as works of philosophy for a general audience. His most recent book is Israel Breathes, World Condemns, 2 volumes. Refuting the Lies Told About Israel, Monogram, Anti-Zionism on Campus, the University, Free Speech and BDS, and Poisoning the Wells, Anti-Semitism in America. His most recent book actually has all proceeds being donated to Israel, and I'll drop the link in the chat to that shortly. His articles address many aspects of the campus environment for Jews and for Israel supporters, including the question of whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. The short answer is yes. He has also published 4 novels, including Nevergreen, an academic satire about campus cancel culture and its harmful effects on the Jews, which, unfortunately, proved prophetic when campuses exploded against Israel and the Jews after the October 7th massacre. His most recent novel, Bright College Years, is about how colleges used to be before they all went crazy. He enjoyed some moments of fame portraying the genius on the former Late Show with David Letterman. For more information about his work, I will post the link to his website, and I'll now turn it over to you, Andrew Pessin. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to Ricky for this honor and privilege of hosting Mr. Abrams here today. Let me urge all folks to give your support to Ricky. It's a grassroots movement, and it puts boots on the ground, as their motto is. They show up, and that's what we need at this particular juncture. American Jews, we need all hands on deck, and Ricky is there. So if you can contribute or even join in, that would be wonderful. Let me also mention the Algeminer, where I'm campus bureau editor. First and foremost, you have to be informed about what's going on. And the Algeminer is a wonderful news site that focuses on issues of concern to Jews and Israel. There's a free daily newsletter which will summarize the day's story. So algeminer.com, sign up for the newsletter and stay informed. It's my great privilege to introduce Mr. Abrams. He will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have maybe 20 minutes of conversation, and then there's time for questions and answers at the end. We were happy to be inundated with well over 100 questions from people who pre-registered. So I've sorted through them. We've got loads, and it's also you'll be able to put questions in the Q&A along the way too, which might make their way into the conversation. So. Mr. Abrams, Elliott Abrams, is Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. He served in the State Department during all 8 years of the Reagan administration in various offices. In 1988, he received the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award from Secretary George Shultz for his work in the department. Mr. Abrams served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor in the administration of President George W. Bush, where he supervised United States policy in the Middle East for the White House. In the Trump administration, he served in the State Department as Special Representative for Iran and for Venezuela. So we don't get more immediate expertise in the workings of governments than what we have in Mr. Abrams. He was a member of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom from 1999 to 2001. He served as a member of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council from 2009 to 2016 and of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy from 2011 to 2023. He is chairman of the TICFA Fund, which is an essential organization doing essential work right now. Perhaps we'll get him to speak a little bit about that at some point. And is a member of the board of the Jewish People Policy Institute. He is the author of 6 books and editor of 3 more, including most recently, just a few months ago, his newest book. I don't know if I can get it on the screen. If You Will It, Rebuilding Jewish Peoplehood for the 21st Century. Absolutely essential reading. Every American Jew needs to read that immediately and begin the conversations. As I said, all hands on deck. This is a book that should be distributed to all hands. Mr. Abrams was educated at Harvard, receiving an undergraduate degree and a law degree from there, as well as a Master's of Science in Economics from the London School of Economics. So once again, the format will be that he'll talk to us on the general subject of Israel's security challenges for maybe 20 minutes, and then we'll turn to some conversation and then to some questions. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce Mr. Elliott Abrams.
Thanks very much. I'm going to call you Andrew, not Professor Pessin. So please call me Elliott.
Thank you.
And
I will.
Thank you. Thanks for that very kind introduction. And let's get started talking about Israel. I think the way I wanted to begin was to say, if we compare Israel's strategic situation and the dangers it faces today to, say, 2 years ago, it's a lot better. A couple of years ago, it looked as if Israel just had no answer to Iran's policy, which was that ring of fire strategy that is surrounding Israel with Iranian proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. Wherever you looked, Israel had an Iranian proxy firing at it. Not today. Today, Hezbollah has been really more than decimated, greatly weakened. The IDF thinks there's a real chance that the Lebanese army is going to stand up finally and keep Hezbollah out of the south. There's a new prime minister, a new president in Lebanon. They are already interfering. We'll see how long it goes, but they're interfering with Iran's efforts to resupply Hezbollah. They basically closed the Beirut airport to Iranian flights. And as you know, Israel's taken up positions guarding against Hezbollah in Lebanon, 5 places, with the support of the United States. That's Hezbollah. Hamas, we'll come back to this, but obviously greatly weakened. It continues to exist as a paramilitary group or guerrilla group, but it is not an army anymore. In Syria, the Assad regime's gone, and Israel now has complete air dominance over Syria, and it has positions protecting the Golan that it did not have a few months ago when Assad was still there. Iran's air defenses, you remember, one of the things Israel did was to just knock them out. These were the Russian S-300 air defense systems. Israel went in there and destroyed them. So the air route from Israel to the Iranian nuclear sites, come back to that, is open. And it has to be said that Israel was dealing with a lot of kibitzing on the part of the United States, on the part of the U.S. administration. Whatever Israel was doing, it was, why do you have to do that? And can't you do less than that? And why do you need so many? And what I've talked this past week to people from the IDF, and the meetings they're having now, what they hear from the State Department and the Pentagon is, what do you need? What do you need? If we have it, it's yours. So the overall security situation, you'd have to say, is a lot better, but there are two great challenges and decisions now. Let's talk about Iran first. I think we need to be prepared politically and psychologically for an Israeli strike on the Iranian nuclear weapons program this year, 2025. They're moving closer and closer to having the ability to build nuclear weapons. Just this past week, the International Atomic Energy Agency says they continue to enrich uranium up to 60%. No country has ever enriched uranium to 60% and not gone on to build nuclear weapons. No country. So you have to ask what Iran is doing, and they do seem to be building steadily, closer and closer to being able to build nuclear weapons. And as you know, Israel cannot and will not permit that. They can't tolerate it. So my judgment is this is the year of the strike. Now, they need to figure out U.S. policy. I was working on Iran in the previous Trump administration. His policy, you remember, was called maximum pressure. But the goal of maximum pressure was a negotiation. It wasn't regime change. He wanted to get them to abandon their nuclear program without having to use force. But now it's 2025. Their nuclear program is much more advanced and time is running out. There is a thing called snapback. That is, people who are in the 2015 nuclear deal, which today means Britain, France, Germany, have the right to snap back all UN sanctions on Iran, but only until this October. And this October, the president of the UN Security Council is Russia. You don't want to wait till the last minute. The Europeans have said, we really got to start this going in June. So the room for negotiation is very small. March, April, May, June. I do not believe a negotiation can succeed. Trump has said he wants more than Obama got. He didn't like the 2015 deal because it was temporary and it was narrow, nuclear only. He wants the proxies included in a permanent deal. So no more aid to the Houthis, no more aid to Hamas, no more aid to Hezbollah, no more death to Israel, no more death to America. I cannot see the Ayatollah agreeing to that because, I mean, what is the Islamic Republic of Iran? What are the ideological pillars that it's built on? Death to America, death to Israel, and I think I'd add repression of women. He's not in great health. He's, I think, 86 now, and knows this may be his last 4 years. I can't see him abandoning those ideological pillars now. Finally, let me just say a word about Gaza and the Palestinians. The Trump plan, you remember, all the Palestinians should leave and the place should be rebuilt. Won't happen, but it was a great idea to say it because it called the bluff of all the Arabs. Those Arab governments have never cared about the Palestinians. I mean, think of this. They all took in hundreds of thousands of Iraqi Arab refugees and Syrian Arab refugees. Why not Palestinians? Because for the Arab states, Palestinians are cannon fodder. They're symbols, they're tools in this great struggle against the existence of a Jewish state. They can't leave because they embody the idea. They're going to go back to the orange groves and there will be no Jewish state. Obviously, that's unacceptable to Israel as well as to the United States. So they're going to propose reconstruction while all Gazans stay in Gaza, and they'll offer some money. But so far, at least, they're all saying they're going to demand a commitment to a Palestinian state. That's part of their price. I would say to you, what is clearer today than it has ever been, there will never be a Palestinian state. The so-called two-state solution is no solution. It cannot happen. It is much too dangerous. Palestinian society, I don't have to tell you this after what we've seen in the treatment of hostages and the murder of hostages, including babies. That's a sick society and a sick political culture. They've never actually wanted a state. They've been offered a state and they've turned it down. The goal of Palestinian nationalism has always been negative, not positive, not to build, but to destroy the Jewish state. To create a Palestinian state now, to go back to the two-state solution, much too dangerous, because that state, if you ever allowed it to exist, would be a launching pad, as Gaza was, for more war against Israel. More war, more violence, more death. Even the status quo, which people say is unsustainable. Well, it's been sustained since 1967. That's a long time. And it is a much more sustainable alternative than a Palestinian state that would be a danger to all its neighbors, not just Israel, but Jordan, even Syria and Lebanon. I want to close with just one more word, and that is, what is the lesson the Israelis learned from October 7th? You've seen that this week the IDF issued its own lessons learned document, and eventually there's going to be a national commission as well. But I think one thing that Israelis agree on is they made the mistake of trying to kind of psychologize their enemy, to think their way into the heads of Hamas. They came to believe, well, Hamas is deterred. We know what they're thinking and we know what they want. They've changed. That is, Israel has changed. They're not going to do that again. They now know, don't think you understand what's going on inside the enemy's head. Look at the enemy's weapons. Look at what they're doing. Listen to what they're saying. Don't be misled. Look ultimately at their capabilities. That was the mistake in Gaza, to think they had deterred Hamas while Hamas was building and building and building militarily. They're not going to make that mistake again with respect to Gaza and Hamas. And they're not going to make that mistake with respect to Iran either, to permit it to get a nuclear weapon that could be used against Israel, which is why I think 2025 is such a fateful year. Well, we want to leave time for some discussion, so why don't I stop at that point, Andrew?
All right. Thank you, Elliott. That was, in that short time, an awful lot to think about. And I should have mentioned that Mr. Abrams, that Elliott has just recently published two very important articles, one in Commentary, one in Foreign Affairs, which touch on these issues. And I think your remarks are drawn from those. So I refer people to those for more detail. So there's a lot to talk about and a lot of questions. So let's maybe start with the last remark. You think Israel has learned an important lesson from this episode. Yeah. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on that. What really was the mistake? You said trying to get into their heads. That's sort of a vague thing. What wrong assumptions did they make about Hamas? Was it that Hamas was being appeased, that Hamas wanted quiet and they now know better? Is that what you're suggesting?
That's fundamentally it. That is, they thought Hamas was deterred. They thought they had a modus vivendi. And the modus vivendi was, Hamas can run Gaza. We're not going to try to overthrow them, take them out of Gaza. And there is going to be some conflict every few years. But basically, they're content with running Gaza. And we don't have to overthrow them. They're not going to invade Israel. They're content with the status quo. And that was just completely wrong. And the problem, of course, when you get that into your head is you don't see what's before your eyes. And the IDF report of this past week said, there were a number of kind of dots, the SIM cards being turned on, the people assembling. There were some early warnings, but in the Israeli security structure, people did not put those together and say, hey, those are all the prerequisites if you were doing a major attack, because they knew there wasn't going to be a major attack because Hamas was deterred, and Hamas was basically happy with getting the money it got from Qatar and running Gaza. And, one of the things they didn't have was what we've sometimes called a red team. That is a team of people whose job it is to sit in a room and say, no, everything is wrong. Think about that again, and to challenge all of the preconceptions. They didn't have that. They didn't do that. And it turned out to be, of course, a horrendous mistake.
Is that a thing? Do governments have, you called it a red room? That's a thing. So
red team.
A red team whose job it is to dissent and look at the opposite side.
Reagan did it. I remember, if you go back, I mean, it's a long time ago now, in the beginning of the Reagan administration, there was a pretty settled view about how the Soviets were doing. And Reagan hired Richard Pipes, who was a Harvard professor of Russian history, to do a team of people to say, okay, start from scratch, from zero, and challenge what State and the Defense Department, CIA, were saying about the Soviet Union and Soviet society. So it is done, and the Israelis, of course, have done it at times too, but they weren't doing it on October 7th.
One wonders, I mean, I hope that Israel learns some of these important lessons, and obviously lots of people have different opinions on things, but it seemed to me, that worldview you described was just obviously false. You just have to look at from the moment, start with Hamas's charter onwards, and they've 100% consistently told you who they are, every single one of their actions and behaviors, whether it was the suicide bombings in the 1990s and the Second Intifada. They've started 4 or 5 wars since they took over power. All of their media messaging, 98% of it is very clear: kill the Jews, expel them, etc., etc. So how is it possible to be sucked into the view like they're happy here? They just want material power. They're not really jihadis, even though they say and act like jihadis 98% of the time. So how can one be sucked into that?
I think the view was not that they had they dropped all of that, but rather that they knew they couldn't do much. They understood the disparity of power. They understood that they could never destroy the state of Israel. So they were more or less content with what they had. Now, that included killing Jews. It included every, 3 years, sending barrages of missiles into Israel. And then the Israelis would do what was known as mowing the lawn, right? They'd go into Gaza. They wouldn't try to get rid of Hamas, but they kind of pushed them back down again. What I think shocked a lot of people in Israel and here was that when you look at the Hamas plan, the plan was not to do only what they did on October 7th, which is horrendous enough. It was to go further, deeper into Israel, and to get Hezbollah to join in on that same day. And that is, that's why Israeli troops were divided on October 7th, October 8th. And many were at the northern border because they suspected there'd be a big Hezbollah attack. And by the way, that would have made for a very difficult day. You can be sure. This is before the Israelis had knocked out maybe 80% of the Hezbollah missiles. Um, but we get back to it as almost an old Jewish proverb, Jewish history teaches that when someone says, we need to kill the Jews, we're going to kill the Jews, they're going to try. They are going to try, and you need to be ready for it.
So, do you think their prosecution of the war since October 7th has reflected the new understanding? And my question there, as I put it to you, is, I worry that obviously world condemnation is instantaneous, and my new books are called Israel Breathes, World Condemned. So, whatever Israel does, no matter what
Yeah.
restraint they show, they're still condemned for it. But did they go all in? I mean, do you think they recognized from the beginning that this time Hamas has to be removed? And if so, wouldn't that have looked a little different in the conduct of the war?
Um, I don't think so. There were
Okay,
certainly questions about the conduct of the war. There were a number of people in the IDF High Command who on October 8th said, forget about Gaza. We should go north.
right.
You need to take care of the stronger enemy first. So that was one question they had to resolve. Then you go south to north in Gaza or north to south? Another question they had to resolve. And they've been, in a sense, making these decisions as they go along in the war. I think the critical thing, though, is the destruction of Hamas and the prevention of Hamas rebuilding. And I think that's a consensus view in Israel. How you go about that will divide people because of, to begin with, the hostages. That is,
Right.
uh, do you forget about the hostages and make war as if they didn't exist? Do you do what Israel's basically been doing, which is make war at the same time that you try to get them out? And there is a view, I think it's the dominant view, that you need that military pressure on Hamas or you'll never get any hostages out, that they give up hostages when they feel more military pressure.
Right.
But I think the consensus is, where do we need to be at the end of this? Where we need to be is with Hamas not only no longer a military force, but no longer ruling Gaza. And that's why you see in today's Israeli press the decision not to give up the so-called Philadelphia
No.
Strip. And that's basically the border between Gaza and Egypt. And that's where all the smuggling takes place. If Israel controls that border, the ability of Hamas to rearm is quite limited. It's not zero. One of the things they're doing right now is using the unexploded ordnance. Israel has dropped a lot in Gaza and 10, 20% doesn't go off. They've complained, in fact, these are American bombs that they're using and
No,
10,
I hadn't heard that.
20% are duds.
Oof.
But Hamas takes those and recovers the explosives and then uses them to build its own ordnance. Um, that's going to require an ongoing IDF effort for a long time now. We're not going to move from where we are now to, a position of perfect peace. There's going to be, I think, a substantial amount of fighting that goes on as Israel insists that when they see Hamas rebuilding, they're going to hit them.
So it seems to me that Hamas is clearly rebuilding. And, when I talk about the prosecution of the war, I'm thinking things like multiple times Israel, their troops would go into an area, they'd clear it at, cost of terrible casualties and et cetera. And then they would leave that area and then have to go back in 2 or 3 times. They never really fully went after central Gaza, which is where like Hamas was located. And then even the long delay going into Rafah, like there are months going by, literally, including, essentially, I think that was Ramadan last year, where they just gave Hamas a free ceasefire and didn't give anything, didn't demand anything back in return, a thing which is obviously relevant right now as we're speaking. And lastly, even the ceasefire deal, which I know it's a Sophie's choice situation. There's no good move here.
Yeah.
But this particular ceasefire deal, we've just seen Israel withdrawing from key places. Hamas reconfigures, rebuilds up, is using the ordnance, as you just said, to build up their weaponry, etc. And then if and when they do have to go back in, which according to your thought, they will, because if the goal they've learned Hamas has to be removed, that means they will have to go back in one way or another. Um, they've now allowed Hamas to regroup, get a whole bunch of weapon. They have to go back into places they already were at the cost of more casualties. So that
Well,
that makes me question, like, are they really
yeah,
all in on that part of it? That
I
that more
think they
goal.
are, but you've got to remember at least two factors, let's call them well, they are military. Two factors that need to go into that decision. One, the hostages.
Yeah.
You can't fight this war as if there were no hostages. Among other things, Israel's a democracy, and the people of Israel want those hostages home. The other is what I'd call pace. Um, you can talk to Israelis now who who are 40, who have a career, a business, and 2 or 3 children, and who were in the army 300 days last year.
Yeah.
So they've got to make this work for a small standing army and a large reserve army that spent most of 2024 fighting. So it's not easy, but
Right.
I think they've clearly, I mean, they know what is the end state that they want. One other thing I'd say about Hamas rebuilding, they will be able to rebuild to some extent using their own workshops, whatever is left, some unexploded ordnance, but they were importing an enormous amount from Egypt, and that's not happening right now. Secondly, while it's true that they're recruiting teenagers who are completely untrained. This is not the force that they had 2 years ago. So their ability as a fighting force, even as a guerrilla group, is not what it used to be.
Okay. So you feel confident that the goal remains. They've learned this lesson. Hamas has to be removed, and now it's just a matter of the ability and the right timing and pace while balancing the hostages, which I have often thought, back to the 1939 white paper, right? The
Hmm.
response that we'll fight the white paper, which was
Yeah,
England restricting immigration, essentially giving up on Zionism. And I think it was Ben-Gurion who said, right, we'll fight but World War II was starting and they had to ally with England. So we'll fight the white paper as if there wasn't a war, and we'll fight the war with Britain as if there wasn't a white paper, which is
yeah.
a wonderful slogan, but I don't know, impossible to actually realize because it's an incredibly difficult situation. So let's maybe move back to your quick comments on the Trump plan, which has certainly
Hmm.
caused a lot of discussion, including, did you see the video that he put out?
I did.
I actually didn't watch it, but I was, amused by the response to it. So you've said, and you said in your article, like, it's not going to happen, or at least certainly not as laid out. So it's just a negotiating ploy. But is it a good idea? Like, if it could happen, in your view, is it like really worth pursuing, moving Gazans out, letting the United States essentially take over? Like, if it could be done,
Uh,
should it be
I
done? I guess is my
Sure,
question.
I'd say
Yeah.
yes. I mean, as I said before, I think we're dealing here with a Palestinian political culture that's really a sick political culture. Political culture now that's built around hatred and violence and honoring terrorist murderers. Um, uh, that's going to be a very, very difficult culture to change. And it would be better for Gazans as well as for Israel if they were able to disperse. If you think about it, why is it crazy in this sense? Germany under Chancellor Merkel took 1,200,000 Syrians. One country, 1,200,000 Syrians. If people were willing to do this, a lot of countries could take 50 or 100,000 Gazans, but nobody is willing to do it. which is why I would say, that's the main reason it's not going to happen. Nobody wants them. Why not? I said one reason, because then you're kind of giving up the great struggle against the Jewish state, right? There's another reason, which is people are afraid. That is, they look at Palestinians and they see a society permeated by violence, and they worry about taking substantial numbers of such people. But what Trump did is something that, in a way, the Arab governments have never done. Trump said, the conditions in Gaza are terrible. It's a demolition site. People are living really, really, really badly. They should have a chance to live a normal life someplace, raise their family, go to work. You don't hear that from the Arab foreign ministers. To them, Palestinians, Gazans aren't people. They're just a cause. So I thought that what Trump said, even though it's not going to happen, was a useful thing to say. And it basically threw the gauntlet down to the Arabs. Okay, you don't like my plan? Let's hear your plan.
Yeah.
And to this day, we really have not heard it. Now, when we hear it, I don't think we're going to like it much, because it's going to include that pledge for a two-state solution.
Yeah. Does the United States, does President Trump have any leverage over any of these countries to encourage them to take 40,000, 50,000? Like, there was talk specific initially, Egypt and Jordan were, the first
Right.
on the list there. And we should have tremendous leverage with those countries. We give them lots of aid and they need us, and et cetera. But it looks like, other than they're saying, oh, we're going to have our own meeting and we're going to come up with our own plan, there hasn't been any motion there. So do you think there's any leverage? Is it possible to twist an arm? And second, I guess the thought would be, is it a good idea to send them there? Because what you might be doing, and maybe you were getting at this, is first of all, destabilizing those countries, and then empowering Israel's enemies on its borders, right? Like,
Yeah.
what you want to do from an Israeli perspective, I imagine, is send them far away, some other Arab Muslim country, not on the borders.
I think you're right. Egypt and Jordan are going to say no because they are afraid. Even though Egypt is a very large country, Sinai is largely
It's enormous,
empty.
right.
Egypt has a population of 100 million. Nevertheless, they worry about ISIS and the Sinai. They worry about radicalism. They would worry about having a Muslim Brotherhood group, which is what Hamas is, building itself up in Sinai. And Jordan, same thing. They have this balance between Bedouin and Palestinian population, and they don't want to unbalance that by taking a lot of Palestinians. So, do we have leverage? Yes, but you never have enough leverage to get somebody to commit suicide if they think that's what they're doing.
Right.
You may disagree, but this is a really, really, this question of Palestinian society, I think, is a very, very deep and difficult problem to deal with. It's taken roughly 100 years to make that society as sick as it is. Go back to the days when Haj Amin al-Husseini was named the Grand Mufti by the British, 1930s. And you remember he spent the war years in Berlin. He was a Nazi.
Yeah.
And from there you can jump to Arafat. And hatred of Jews has become part of that culture. And there are squares and schools and named after terrorist murderers, honoring them for killing Jews. You teach that generation after generation after generation. How do you unlearn it? It can be done. And, it's interesting, actually. There's an organization in Israel called Impact SE. And what Impact SE does is it looks at textbooks. And the model here, the ideal, is the United Arab Emirates, which has completely revamped its textbooks so they do not at all teach hatred or anti-Semitism. They teach tolerance. And a lot of countries are actually beginning to do this. The Saudis are changing their textbooks.
I read
Egypt
that too, yeah.
is changing slowly, but it's happening.
Right.
And the Palestinians and the UNRWA textbooks were terrible. So you do that for generation after generation. Turning it around is going to be extremely difficult.
Right. You mentioned UNRWA, and I know we'll get to that in the Q&A, which we'll get to in just a couple of minutes, which is crucial because I think you could make the case, and again, we'll get to that in a couple of minutes, that the UNRWA is going to have to be removed as Israel is making motions now to get rid of it because UNRWA is the source of this educational problem. So before we get to the Q&A, I just one more thought about the first part of your comments about Iran. I think it struck me you painted a very bleak picture there. It's a runaway train. It's getting very, very close. And are you feeling optimistic about given the short time frame that's available, as you were sketching, is there any chance or hope for Trump pressure to reach the kind of agreement that he hopes to reach, or is it inevitable there's going to be military action and soon?
The problem, I think, is time is running out. He did the maximum pressure campaign on Iran in 2019 and 2020, not for 4 years, only for the last 2 years. Now he started it again, but they're a lot closer to a bomb.
Right.
At that point, you could say, well, if he had been reelected, you keep the maximum pressure on, and over the course of those 4 years, maybe you can negotiate a deal. Now it's 4 years later, and they've got, according to the IAEA, 6 bombs worth of enriched uranium now. They don't appear to have a warhead, but they don't appear to have. I mean,
how would we know? Right.
Right. Is their intelligence perfect? If you think back to the other cases, India, Pakistan, North Korea, we were surprised when they announced we are a nuclear power, a nuclear weapons state. So I don't think the Israelis are going to take that risk. Now, is it possible to negotiate something? Sure. Here you have the Ayatollah, as I said, 86, poor health, maybe his last years. What does he want to do? It is plausible to me that he will say, I want a rush program to get a nuclear weapon while I'm still alive. If that's true, then he's going to get bombed. Is it conceivable that he would say, we're coming to a transition when I go, and that needs to be a period of calm. So it's time to do a deal. Is it conceivable? Yes, but we've seen no evidence for it. The evidence suggests that they're moving steadily in the direction of preparing for nuclear weapons. So now,
doesn't look good.
The President Trump has said, look, they can't have a nuclear weapon. We will not let them have a nuclear weapon. The only question is, how do you do it? I mean, you can do it by hitting them, or you can do it by negotiating with them. He said, I prefer the latter. In the end, it's going to be up to them. I think the question really becomes, at a certain point, is this something Israel does, or is this something the United States does?
Right. So my last thought on this is regime change. Is there any chance? Is there any hope? I know that you mentioned in your article, he's got a restive population. We see, lots of protests get reported. They seem to get squelched, etc. When he goes, is there a chance that the counter-revolution comes back? Which
there is a chance. There is a chance. I mean, every indication we have is that the population hates the regime, and they stay in power by repression. But the tools of repression are very good. I'm confident that that regime will fall someday. Even the Soviet Union fell.
Right.
Thing is, we don't know whether it's 25 days or 25 years.
Right.
And that timeline is a lot longer than the nuclear timeline.
Right. Okay. Let's turn to questions that have been submitted. There are so many and not a whole lot of time. So some of them have been just addressed along the way. There is, I think, an important question about Qatar. There's several related questions of Qatar, which is, to summarize them, what are they doing in the mix? Are they friend or foe? Why are they considered an ally when it seems to many people's eyes they support Hamas, they fund Hamas in the negotiations, they take Hamas's side. So what is Qatar's status, and what can we do about Qatar?
You get a lot of different opinions about this in Washington. You get a lot of people saying they really are very, very helpful. You'll also find an awful lot of people in Washington who are on their payroll directly or indirectly.
That's a follow-up question. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, a lot.
Right.
My answer is they are a radical government in their views. They are basically supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. Al Jazeera is poison.
It is.
It was poisoned during the Iraq War, where it incited people to kill American soldiers. It is poison today. If you read that vast majorities of Arabs don't know, don't believe what Hamas did on October 7th, don't believe they murdered the Bibas family. Why don't they believe
Right.
it? Well, one reason is
Al
Al
Jazeera.
Jazeera never broadcasts any of that. So I wish that we would use Egypt, for example, as the intermediary, not Qatar. I don't think they're fundamentally on our side. And I think their influence in Washington stems primarily from the fact that they are spreading around just tons and tons of money.
Right, and including, as well reported, to the universities, which
Oh, yeah.
empoisons, right, the campus scene. So,
Yeah.
is there any chance in a Trump administration that the bar will be brought down on Qatar? That we have leverage, we have a base there, we could declare them
Yeah.
not an ally. Do you see that as something to be hopeful for, or not?
It's possible. I'm not hopeful. I mean, we should long ago, I was one of the people back in the Bush years urging that we at least do a study of moving that base out of Qatar. That would scare them.
Right.
The Pentagon didn't want to do it. It's a great base. They pay for everything. It's wonderful. It's not even a good base geographically, because if you think of it, they're next door to Iran. If we ever got into a fight with Iran, that base is very vulnerable. It'd be a lot safer to move it a couple of 100 miles further from Iran. But the Pentagon has never wanted to do that. And I don't think Trump is going to do it either. I'm not optimistic.
Okay, in the same category, Turkey? What are your views on Turkey's roles as a noxious ally, quote unquote
Yeah,
ally, a member of NATO, and yet so clearly not just hostile, but actively supporting hostility against Israel?
yeah.
Is there, and
I mean, the difference, I guess, is it's, if I can put it this way, a real country. That is, it's a real country in size and in population. I keep hoping for the day when Erdogan is defeated in an election. Not impossible. His party did lose the mayoralty in
right,
Istanbul in the last election. But for now, a very, very worrisome opponent of Israel. I worry about them, for example. What you begin to hear now is that the money that used to go from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon can't go anymore across Syria. So where does it come from? It comes down from Turkey.
right.
And Turkey's becoming the new transit point. Erdogan is no friend of the United States, and he's certainly an enemy of Israel. And I think American policy is basically to try to wait him out.
Right. I mean, I worry, just to follow up on that thought, that if Turkey should go to war with Israel, what happens with like NATO, right? Those alliances, and it's
Yeah.
not inconceivable, especially now with Syria, because Turkey's made inroads in Syria. Now Israel is, as of this morning, being reported that they're behind the Druze, sort of seceding. So is that an Israel-Turkey war just a few steps away? And
No,
then
I
what
don't think.
happens? No.
Yeah,
Then what
I don't think
happens with
that happens.
NATO at that
I
point?
don't think that happens.
Okay, that's
And
good.
happily, they don't have a border. And I think the Turks would be afraid of not just Israel, but of their relations with the United States in
Okay.
that case. But it's hard. I mean, I don't know if you're under about probably 50 years of age, you don't remember that Turkey and Israel, like Iran and Israel, were once allies.
Once friends, right?
And it's all Erdogan.
Yeah. Okay. Shifting gears a little bit, there's very timely questions, including about this morning's news of Israel halting aid going into Gaza. Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think Israel's going to stick to that and hold on to that? Is it just a ploy? What are your thoughts? And is it an acceptable idea? There's this follow-up question there, like, by international law, is
Well,
this a war crime? So,
do you remember? This always amazes me. Do you think, I mean, obviously you don't, but college kids sometimes do. Do you think that during the Second World War, we fed Germany? or tried to cut off
Right.
food from Germany? Do you think that we fed Japan, or we tried to prevent food from being imported by Japan, and oil, among other things? This is a war. Now, normally what happens in case of war is that the civilian population flees. Think back, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the civilian population moves out of the way. The only war I can think of where the civilian population is told, don't you dare move,
Right.
is Gaza.
Right.
Will the Israelis be able to keep this going? I think they're going to come under very, very, very heavy pressure. Not so much by the US, but I think by the UN and the Europeans, to start letting food in. One of the reasons that they're stopping is Hamas commandeers all the food.
Right.
I mean, what happens to it when it goes in? It doesn't go in little baskets, to each resident in the mail. Hamas and other criminals take over. So I think what they're doing is right. At the very least, they're calling attention to the fact that Hamas is stopping the hostage liberation.
Yeah.
And that's not acceptable and shouldn't be acceptable. Anybody who wants to pressure Israel to say, no, 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 you can't do this, should be putting equal pressure on Hamas.
So then why didn't they and couldn't they and shouldn't they have done this on October 8th of 2023, which, some of the ministers on that day said, that's it, no food, no water, no electricity. And then, of course, the world condemned them for collective punishment instantly before even, they were underway in the
before it
battle.
happened.
But if this
Yep.
is, what if on October 8th they had said, no food, water, electricity goes in until hostages come out? Was that not doable back on October 8th? And is it doable now?
It may be more doable now because of the understanding of the barbarity of Hamas and its treatment of hostages and murder of hostages. But it also may be more doable now because, Trump, in a sense, has given his alternative. Let people out to places where there's plenty of food.
Yeah.
But I do think I think they can do this for a while, but they can't do it for more. Probably the pressure grows in a couple of weeks.
A couple of weeks. So, and given that this is coming after 6 weeks of flooding the Gaza with aid, and the reports are that Hamas's warehouses are, overflowing, is it a useless gesture because they can easily ride out a couple of weeks, even a couple of months?
It isn't useless because it is a reminder of the seriousness of the stakes. I do want to say one other thing about food and hunger. Hamas is pretty good, as we know, at propaganda. You have never seen on Al Jazeera or anywhere else starving Gazan children who look like they've come out of a concentration camp with spindly legs and bloated stomachs. Right. We've sometimes seen this in famines in Africa. If they existed, you'd have seen it.
Yeah.
It never existed. This whole thing about the war crime and crime against humanity of using starvation as a weapon, which is the case against Netanyahu in the International Criminal Court, lies from start to finish, just lies.
Yeah. Well, and as we know, they've been supplying aid quite voluminously for many months. Yeah. And, they occasionally with Pallywood, right? They'll send images of sickly people, but it turns out they have terminal illnesses and things like that. They're not actually starving. Right. You mentioned, the pressure from the UN. So here's a very general question, like, what the hell do we do with the UN, UNRWA, ICC, ICJ, the Red Cross now? Like, what's the move there? Both, and that would involve, I'm sure, Trump. We would need Trump's support, but can Israel just ignore the UN, or do we have to fix it somehow?
They do a pretty good job at ignoring the UN.
Yeah.
I'd say it depends on what you mean by the UN. What to do about UNRWA? Simple. UNRWA should be killed.
Yeah.
UNRWA is part of the struggle against the survival of the Jewish state, and it should simply be eliminated. And the other parts of the UN, like the World Food Program, High Commission for Refugees, should take over, treating Palestinians the way they've treated real refugees forever. On the International Criminal Court, I mean, the Israelis should treat it with the contempt they do, with which the United States treats it. And I'm very pleased that the US government, that Congress has voted that, for example, the prosecutor cannot set foot in the United States and is being sanctioned. That's the way to treat them. There
Yeah.
are pieces of the UN, I mentioned the World Food Program, really good and really well run. The Red Cross is a different thing because it's not formally part of the UN. It's an independent body. And it used to be, by the way, the blue chip agency. Um, and I think they've got to come to grips now with the way they have been turned into extras on Hamas's movies.
Yeah.
They've never had to deal with anything like this before, and they have not been able to figure out what to do. So they're, as somebody put it, they're basically an Uber service now
Right. Right.
for
Yeah.
Hamas.
Right. Since we're running short on time, let's move domestically now and talk about some of the questions about America. And there's questions about the American Jewish community and also relationships with Christians. Let me mention the Christian one first. Someone remarks that 30 years ago, you wrote a book called Faith or Fear, Encouraging American Jews to Embrace American Evangelical Christians. How do you feel today about that thesis, or what role do
Mhm.
they have to play in the support of Israel and the Jewish community? And at the same time, this will
Yep.
be maybe a segue to your little couple of remarks, some minutes about your recent book. What can we do to get the American
Yes.
Jewish community up and all hands on deck and actively engaged?
It's still the case that the vast majority of pro-Israel Americans are Christian, not Jews. There's only a few million Jews. Um, and the evangelical community has been particularly supportive of Israel. But there's a real worry now, which is that among Americans generally, including American Jews, support for Israel declines with youth. People who are 70 are much more supportive than people who are 40, who are much more supportive than people who are 18. That's true of Christians and Jews and evangelicals. And there's a real campaign against evangelical support for Israel. But my view is that there are about 100 million evangelicals in the United States. It's still a very, very, very important um, community of potential and real supporters of Israel that the American Jewish community should be really careful about. Um, I have been very disappointed, as so many American Jews have in the last year, if you look at the level of support, generally speaking, from Christian groups in America. Certainly, the mainstream churches have been on the wrong side, basically on the Hamas side. And we just haven't had the support that I think one might have hoped to get. But I would like, when it comes to this question and when it comes to anti-Semitism, my basic view is, yes, we have to enforce the law. If you commit a crime against a Jew, you should be prosecuted. If you're on campus, you violate the rules, you should be tossed out instantly. But I think we should be spending more time on Jews than on Christians. That is, I think
Right.
the best answer to anti-Semitism is to strengthen the American Jewish community. The book was written, if you will it, of course, the famous line of Herzl, if you will it, it is no dream, um, basically makes the argument that a couple of generations ago, American Jews lived as Jews because they lived together. They lived in pretty dense, urban, often immigrant neighborhoods. That's not true anymore. To build a sense of Jewish peoplehood, you need to do it intentionally. And how do you do it? Immersive Jewish experiences. And in the book, I discuss three: Jewish education, Jewish summer camping, which is often thought of as sort of nice but not important. It's very important because for many American Jewish kids, it's the only immersive Jewish experience they have. And finally, time in Israel. We know this from Birthright and many other programs. And the more time, the better. American kids who are 18 should be meeting their Israeli peers who are not playing ultimate frisbee. They're fighting and dying for their country. It can be a transformative experience. So more time in Israel. Junior year abroad, summer abroad, gap year, more is better.
I know you've done some full-length podcast interviews, including, I think, a Tikva podcast. I think you did one. Was that, am I right?
Yep.
Talking about the book at length. So I do urge the audience to go learn more about it and, of course, get the book. That brings us to the last question. And tying into what you said about evangelicals, Rhode Island Coalition for Israel, which is a sponsor of this event, boots on the ground, as I mentioned earlier, works very hard with local Christian communities here because those ties are so essential. And so that leads to the last question, which is, what do you see as the role of local groups, or maybe I'll put that a little more generally, like what can folks do to fight? Now, I keep saying all hands on deck. So for the individuals in the audience, what can they do today? What can they do this week to join the battle for Jews and for Israel?
I think there are two ways to think about this, or at least two. One is your own family and what are you doing with children or grandchildren? Even with birthright, sending hundreds of thousands of young Jews to Israel. Only 45% of American Jews have ever set foot in Israel. That's a scandalously low figure if you compare, I don't know, Canadian Jews, Australian Jews. So think about your own family, your own children, your own grandchildren, and how could they go on a trip to Israel? Could they spend a summer there? Could they go to a Jewish camp where they live as Jews among Jews? Secondly, in the community itself, there are all over this country, there are opportunities to engage with Christian groups, as you were just saying. There are campuses, unfortunately, in every state in which Jewish students are battling, sometimes alone, against anti-Semitic, pro-Hamas groups on campus, and or dealing with college administrations that are hopeless, and that have defended every minority group except Jews, and that will not enforce the rules. And those Jewish students also need help and advice. And then finally, local politics too. That is the local city council, is the mayor actively fighting against anti-Semitism in your own community? What's being taught in the local schools about all of this? And in many places, it's actually quite shocking and shameful what is being taught. So there are, it's a big country, and there are thousands and thousands of front lines where people can get involved.
Elliott, thank you so much. I'm sorry, there's so much we didn't get to. I would love to talk more about politics and the Democrats and the campus situation and the work of the tikvahfund.org in establishing Jewish education, creating curricula. They've now established it's a middle school and a high school. Am I right? And also
Yes.
a college program at University of Florida. So I urge folks to check out the tikvahfund.org
tikvah.org.
tikvah.org.
And take a look at what we're doing, which is
it's amazing. It's groundbreaking and it's essential. So everyone should check that out. Thank you so much for your time. We are very, very grateful. I will now turn it over to Maria to just wrap things up.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this important discussion, and thank you for that, Mr. Abrams. That was incredible. I just, wanted to let folks know that the event recording and some action steps will be sent to everyone via email, but just wanted to reiterate again that one thing you can do to support our efforts is consider giving us a donation as a small grassroots nonprofit. Anything that you can give goes a long way. I also put links to subscribe to our newsletter where you can stay up to date with what we're doing, other events, and action alerts that we send out frequently. And then again, I did link Elliott Abrams' recent book. You should definitely go and check it out. And I look forward to staying in touch with everybody and keeping up the good fight. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Elliott. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.